Thanks, Curtis. It's so nice to be talking with you guys tonight. Curtis asked me to talk about evangelism, which for the kids here is a long word for sharing our faith in Jesus with our neighbors, with our school friends, with people we might meet out and about in our lives. And I'm delighted to have a whole bunch of younger people in this room, because before I say anything else about evangelism, I want to say all of us, whatever age we are, however long we've been a Christian, however much time we've spent studying the Bible, if we are followers of Jesus today, then evangelism is actually all of our job. So this is something that I'm hoping that I'll be able to speak in ways that the kids in the room are going to be able to grab onto as well. That there might be some pieces that might be more for the grown-ups, but if you can stay with me, I would really appreciate that. So I'm going to start with a story about a friend of mine from grad school when I was doing my PhD back in the UK. He is now a professor of the natural sciences at Harvard. He's so smart that he's not just a professor of one science, he's a professor of the natural sciences, like one of the smartest guys I know. And he and I became good friends when we were in grad school in the UK. And his background is that he is culturally Jewish, but he is an atheist, which means he doesn't believe in God at all. And he and I have been sort of talking about my faith and his not faith for a long time at this point. And a few years ago, I invited him to an event at Harvard where the agnostic chair of the Harvard Philosophy Department was having a conversation with a famous Christian New Testament professor called N.T. Wright, who some of the grown-ups might have heard of. And the title of the event was The Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. And after the event, I said to my friend, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. His girlfriend at the time, who was a much gentler person than either me or my friend, said, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around a first-century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said, yes. I said, the problem is, I think that you believe some crazy things as well. Now, in the time I have this evening, I want to say 4 things about evangelism. There are so many other things that could be said about evangelism. But I want to say 4 things. The first is that evangelism is hard. The second is that evangelism is humble. The third is that evangelism is hospitable, which is a long word for welcoming. And the fourth is that evangelism is hopeful. So evangelism is hard. Evangelism is humble, evangelism is hospitable, and evangelism is hopeful. Because you see, I think that my friend believes some crazy things as well, and I've seen a number of people in my life go from thinking that Christianity was just completely crazy to actually putting their trust in Jesus. So number 1, evangelism is hard. Raise your hand if you have ever seen a sign that looks a bit like this in your neighborhood. Okay, I should have had to raise your hand if you've never seen one, because you probably haven't been looking if you have not seen one of these. So this sign, there are various sort of variations on this theme that you might see, slightly different versions of it. But it says something like this: in this house we believe that Black lives matter, love is love, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, and kindness is everything. Now, I don't know how you feel when you see signs like this, but my guess is that for many of us, when we see a neighbor who's put up a sign like this, or when we enter a store that has a sign like this kind of feels like a big roadblock to evangelism, to telling somebody about your faith in Jesus. Because a lot of people who would put up a sign like this think that Christianity is not only crazy, but actually immoral, that it's mostly causing bad things in the world. And it can be really hard, if you're a Christian like me, to feel kind of like the bad guy a lot of the time. And to feel like even before you can have a conversation with somebody about Jesus, that you're going to have to sort of get through this great big wall in front of you or between you and that person. Does anybody feel like that, or is it just me who feels that way sometimes? Yeah. Now, one of the things, and I don't have time to sort of go through this blow by blow, but one of the really interesting things about this sign is, number one, that actually some of the claims on this sign are things that Christians really, really do deeply believe. Another thing to understand is that this sign is kind of planted in Christian soil. Now, I realize it's kind of a bit of a mixed idea because you can't really plant a sign and expect it to grow and sort of sprout into a big tree. But the basis of these claims on this sign is the idea that human beings are fundamentally morally equal. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, or what your racial background is, or what country you come from, or whether you're rich or poor, or whether you're sort of healthy or sick, that actually everybody is fundamentally equal. Like, that's one of the basic assumptions underneath this sign. And most people today in our city, even if they don't think that they're Christians at all, they might think that they're atheists or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu. Most people believe that that's just like basic moral common sense. In actual fact, if you look back over history, you'll find that that idea that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal is actually a specifically Christian belief. That's where it's come from. And that if you pull Christianity out from the foundation, it's not like, and for the kids in the room, you might play Jenga, you know that game where you sort of build a tower out of these little blocks, and you have to try and like inch pieces out and make a higher tower because you've taken a piece out. A lot of people think you can sort of pull Christianity, even if it is the source of some of these things, you can pull it out of the foundation and build an even higher moral tower. Actually, it's more like pulling a pin on a grenade. Everything explodes when you pull Jesus out of the foundation of these signs. But I think this is one of the reasons that it can make evangelism feel really hard and in many ways be really hard in our cultural environment today. Because when we open our mouths to say that we're Christians, people will often have a lot of assumptions about what we think and believe. Some of them will be right, but they might have they've heard the worst version of those ideas. Some of them might be really wrong. And it can be really disorienting for us as Christians to even sort of enter those conversations. And the basic message that we are communicating when we are sharing the gospel with somebody includes the fact that they, like us, are sinners and that they're standing in God's judgment if they don't accept Jesus' death for them. And that's like so offensive. You know, that's actually more offensive than anything else that our friends might think is offensive about Christianity. So evangelism is really hard. Number two, evangelism is humble. Now, what do I mean by that? One of my favorite verses in the Bible that communicates the gospel is a verse in a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to his friend Timothy. It's 1 Timothy 1:15, and it goes like this. This is a trustworthy saying, worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. This is the Apostle Paul speaking, okay? Now, he could have stopped the verse before the end. He could have said, this is a trustworthy saying, worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. And that's true. But he actually adds on, of whom I am the foremost, or the worst, some translations put it. And Paul is arguing that the reason that Jesus saved him was to show that even somebody as bad as Paul could be saved by Jesus' death. Now, a lot of people think that Paul is kind of this self-righteous guy who's writing all these letters, throwing stones at other sinful people. Actually, no. If you read Paul's letters carefully, you'll find that he thinks he's the worst sinner he knows. And I think when we enter into conversations about Jesus with friends or neighbors who might not be Christians, it's easy for us to think that, you know, we should stand on the moral high ground up here and look down at those people. Or they might think that we're doing that our message is, you know, I'm so good, God is so pleased with me, come and be like me. But actually that's the opposite of the Christian message. Instead of being on the moral high ground, we're right down here saying, I'm so bad that Jesus, the Son of God, had to come and die for me. So in some ways, like even those signs like this can be really hard for us, and some of the conversations we'll have with friends who aren't Christians can be really hard because we feel like we're positioned as the bad guy. In some ways, I think that's not a bad thing, because it can remind us that we need to be humble. I'm not quite athletic enough to jump back up there. And it can help us when we're looking at some claims on these signs. So, for example, when people say that the lives of black people matter, one of the things they're pointing to is the history of the ways in which the lives of black people haven't been treated like they mattered in Western history, in the history of this country. And one of the things that I think as Christians we need to say is like, that is profoundly sinful. That's really wrong. And a lot of churches and Christian leaders in history have actually been part of that, and that's sinful. We know that from the Bible, that that's sinful. But it can kind of help us to have that humility coming into those conversations. Evangelism is hard, and evangelism, I think if we're doing it right, is humble. And that's something that, honestly, I find difficult. I find when I'm in the conversation with somebody and I disagree with them, it's really easy to just kind of get into a place where I want to prove that I'm right and that they're wrong, and I want to kind of get back onto my moral or intellectual high ground. But actually, as Christians, I think we need to continually monitor where our heart is. Are we getting proud? Because that's something that Jesus and the scriptures diagnose as one of our biggest sin problems, is actually pride. So if we're feeling like, do you know what, it's really hard to talk to friends about Jesus, and sometimes they say things about me that are not true and feel really hurtful, and that makes me kind of feel a bit low, I think that there are actually good things in there for us, because evangelism is hard and evangelism is humble. Now, the third point is evangelism is hospitable. And like I said, that's kind of a fancy word for saying welcoming. And there are a couple of things that I mean by that. Number one is that one of the basic things that we as Christians are called to do is to be welcoming and hospitable to other people, especially to the people who might be getting left out by others. Maybe because they're not very popular, or maybe because they don't have much money, or maybe because they come from another place and they don't speak the language here well, or for whatever reason, we're especially to be welcoming to people who are maybe being left out by others. I think there's a especially powerful thing that Christians can do today is welcoming neighbors, colleagues, classmates into your house. And one of the things I love about Curtis's preaching over the years, I've been here 15 years, so I sometimes get to hear things a few times, which is fantastic. And one of the things that Curtis has said a number of times is you don't need to make your house or your dorm room or your apartment look perfect before you invite anybody around. And you don't need to have cooked this glorious meal that they're going to be writing about for the next 10 years of their life about how amazing it was. What Curtis says is you should say to people, come and eat pizza in my messy house. Now, anyone who's been to my house will know that I definitely always have the messy house part. Often it's pizza, often it's cheesy pasta, which is what my kids most like to eat. But just welcoming people into our homes or into our lives or into our church events, maybe the paint night that Lou did for us the other night, just inviting people and welcoming them in has always been something Christians are called to. But I think actually especially in our time today, when the extent of loneliness has become what people sometimes call an epidemic, kind of like COVID was an epidemic, or I guess a pandemic, a problem that was everywhere, that loneliness has become a problem that's everywhere in our society, that a lot of people are kind of stuck by themselves, often with their phones or their computers, and not really relating to other human beings face-to-face, people who they can hug, people who they can eat with, people who they can laugh with. So actually there's hospitality today is even more powerful than it was 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Just welcoming people into our homes and into our lives. It's one thing we can do actually even every Sunday morning. So every Sunday morning, people come into our church for the first time. Now, they might have moved here from another place where they were previously very much involved in a church and they've come here to find a new church. Or this might be the first time in years that they've been near a church, or it might be the first time ever that they've walked into a church. And this is, if you're a regular part of this church, this is our family, this is our home. And what do you do if somebody knocks on your door to come to your home? You welcome them, right? You think, oh, it's my job to say hello. It's my job to ask them if they want something to drink, to tell them to take a seat. There's a way that we can exercise and show hospitality and welcome to people just on a Sunday morning as they walk through the door. And there are so many opportunities there, actually, for people to hear the gospel message of Jesus for the first time in their lives, or to hear it for the first time after something really hard has happened in their lives, and they're for the first time in a long time actually open to learning about Jesus. So we can show hospitality, and kids, this is true for you as well. Like if there's a family that comes and there are kids who are here for the first time, they may never have been in a church before, and they may not know what to do, and they may think, well, I don't have any friends here. You could just say, hey, come and play on the playground with me, or can I show you where the cookies are? That could be a great way for you to show hospitality and to give people a chance to hear about Jesus and to want to come back and hear more. So those are some basic ways we can show hospitality. There's one more way, which is like maybe the term hospitality, I'm using it in a slightly not literal way. And that is, I think we can show hospitality and welcoming by listening to what other people believe. Now, one of the big problems we have in our society at the moment is that people think that in order to love somebody, you have to agree with everything they say. Actually, that's not true. And as Christians, we should find that we actually disagree with a lot of things that our school friends or our neighbors or our colleagues say and think. But we can show love to them, which is what the Bible calls us to do, by listening to them and trying to understand not just what do they believe, but why do they believe it? And not just what do people in general who believe what they say they believe, but what does that particular person believe? So you might meet somebody and they tell you that they are Hindu. Now, you might or might not know much about Hinduism as a religion, but whether you know a lot or not much, you might think, oh, well, I kind of know what you believe because you told me that you're a Hindu. In actual fact, you might find that this person doesn't have all the beliefs that most Hindus have, or maybe they've had a particular experience of Hinduism. Maybe they honestly have no idea what Hinduism even means, but they were raised in a family that said it was Hindu, and so that's kind of what they've been used to saying. It can be so helpful if we show hospitality to people by saying, I actually want to listen to you. I want to understand what you believe and why. If you're angry against Christians because of some of the things represented on this sign, I want to understand, like, what in your life has caused you to be angry there. Where have you experienced pain or hurt? In my experience, even when people have come to me, which honestly they somewhat often do because I talk a lot in public about controversial things, when people come to me angry, almost always, if I properly listen to what they're saying, they go away feeling loved. Now, it's not hard listening to somebody, actually. It mostly involves shutting up and asking them just a few questions and kind of giving them space to talk. And it's kind of easy to be quiet and to listen. But I think it's a way that we can show hospitality. And if we want our friends and our colleagues and our neighbors to listen to what we believe about Jesus, then we should probably show them the basic hospitality of listening to what they believe. Doesn't mean we agree with what they believe or affirm what they believe, but the more we can understand what they believe, the more we can help them understand what we're trying to say as Christians. So that's the third point, that evangelism is hospitable. The fourth is that evangelism is hopeful. Now, I told you a story at the beginning about a friend of mine from grad school who was an atheist back then, and unless a lot has changed in the last couple of weeks since I last talked to him, is an atheist today. I haven't lost hope for him. But I want to tell you the story of another friend of mine from grad school, who's actually a better friend of Brian, my husband's, at the time, but a friend of mine too, who, when she went to do her PhD in the history of science at Cambridge, was a convinced atheist. She came from Australia. She's now a professor of history in Australia. She was a convinced atheist when she went to Oxford University to do her postgrad work there. But while she was at Oxford, she got really excited because there was going to be a lecture series by another guy from Australia who's a philosophy professor, very famous atheist philosopher called Peter Singer. Some of you might have heard of him. Peter Singer, instead of thinking, well, we can just assume that all human beings are fundamentally equal, like most people who put these signs up do, he says, no, we can't assume that because he doesn't have any Christian foundation for that. He says, instead, we need to evaluate beings human and non-human, so humans and animals, on the basis of their capacities. So, for example, their capacity to suffer, their capacity for self-awareness, kind of understanding who they are and what their life is like. And by Peter Singer's calculation, a human baby is less morally valuable than an adult pig. Now, when my friend and Brian's friend, who's called Sarah, when she heard these lectures, she had this, what she later described as kind of intellectual vertigo. She sort of felt like she was going to fall over because she'd thought that atheism was the foundation for all the things that she most deeply believed about morality and about human beings. In fact, she'd thought that Christianity was the enemy of universal human rights and love across racial difference and care for the poor and equality for men and women. But she gradually discovered it's actually the foundation for those things. And she ended up becoming a Christian. I only found this out, sort of funny side note, because we were sort of friends on Facebook. And a number of years ago, she married a guy who was like so obviously Christian. He was like posting Bible verses. I thought, what on earth has happened that Sarah Irving has married like this Christian guy? And so I sent her a message, and I was like, hey, it seems like you maybe became a Christian, because I could tell from the way he was posting that he was like the kind of Christian guy who would not have married a girl who was not a Christian, you know. And so she told me this story, and it's something that delights Brian to this day, because honestly, when we were hanging out with her back in grad school, neither of us would have thought that she was going to put her trust in Jesus. But through various steps along the way, including her now husband falling in love with her and praying really hard that she would become a Christian and marry him, despite the fact he was one of her undergraduate students. That's a whole other story. Let me tell you, I want to give him my prayer list because he married up in every possible way. Evangelism is hopeful because even the most unlikely people do become Christians. I mentioned that verse from Paul's letter to Timothy. This is a trustworthy saying, worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. Nobody would have looked at Paul before he became a Christian and thought, there's a guy who's going to become a Christian soon. He was going around like literally trying to get Christians killed because he hated Christianity so much. And Jesus completely turned him around. And that's something that if you go on in your Christian life, you will see again and again is some very unlikely people becoming Christians. We've got some folks from our community group in the room tonight. And one of the women at our community group, Paige Brooks, not the Paige Brooks who's here, but the Paige Brooks who is not here. Very confusing. We were talking in community group last year about how hard it can sometimes be to believe that there's a hope that a friend or family member who seems very against Christianity would become a Christian. And Paige said, yeah, I mean, the thing is, there are just some people who you think, I just cannot imagine this person becoming a Christian. And I said, I understand that. But if I'd met you 3 years ago, I'd have said that about you. She laughed out loud. She was like, yeah, fair point. Like, she was not a likely candidate for somebody who had come to serious faith in Jesus. And yet, Jesus is in the business of saving unlikely people, like me, and like you, and like Paige, and like Paul, and like my friend Sarah. So that's one sense in which evangelism is hopeful. Another sense in which evangelism is hopeful is perhaps the most obvious one. Because when we are telling people the message of Jesus, we are telling them that the God of all the universe, the God who made the stars and the planets and you and me and every other human being in the world, loves them so much that he sent his son to die for them. People today are desperate for love, and they are looking for it often in all the wrong places. But the message of the gospel is at heart a message of God's love for every person who you're sharing the gospel with. As people go on in life, it's easy, depending on your life circumstances, it can be really easy as a younger person to not reckon with the fact that you're going to die. But as you get older, and as more and more people you love die, you will have to reckon with the fact that one day all of us are going to die. A few years ago, I was driving with my kids. Luke wasn't born yet, but Miranda and Eliza were. And we were driving past a graveyard. And Eliza, who was, I think, maybe 5 at the time, she said, Mum, is that where all the dead people are? And I said, yeah. She said, oh, that's gross. I said, don't be too superior to the dead people. You're going to be one of them one day. But if you put your trust in Jesus, then he's going to call you out of your grave. That is a message of hope that every single person in this city desperately needs to hear. And if they actually face up to the fact that they are dying, even if it's slowly, even if it's going to take decades, all of us are dying. I hate to give you that diagnosis tonight. We're all dying, and so is every one of our non-Christian friends. But the message of the gospel includes the beautiful reality that 2,000 years ago, this first century Jewish man who died on a cross was also raised to new life. He wasn't just kind of revived, like had a near-death experience. He actually died, and he actually broke through death so that he could then welcome anyone who puts their trust in him to everlasting life with him. You know, the message of Christianity is offensive, but it is also unbelievably good news. It is ultimately the hope that all of our friends and all of our classmates and all of our family members are desperately searching for. It is a hope that can take them through death and into everlasting life. We have that hope to share. And that's what evangelism is ultimately going to be about. Giving a reason, as Peter says, for the hope that we have, but to always do so with gentleness and respect. So I'm going to see if you can remember the 4 points. This is test time, kids. I hope you're listening, okay? Evangelism is fantastic. Look, you all listened. I feel like it's hard to do evangelism in general. And it's easy, honestly, for us all to want to sort of put it off one way and another. Where maybe it's in a particular relationship where you're thinking, well, if I only got to know this person more, then maybe there would come the time when I could tell them that I'm a Christian or look for an opportunity to talk to them about Jesus. Or maybe when I've read the Bible more and kind of learnt more myself, maybe that will be the time for me to start telling other people about Jesus. Or maybe, we'll come up with, I'm guilty of this as well, we'll come up with all sorts of reasons why today is not the day to take any kind of action to try and tell somebody about Jesus. So I want to just offer you something that could help you in evangelism in the coming weeks, because we've got Easter coming up, which in our culture is definitely not as big a deal as Christmas, but still something that, a lot of people are aware of and in some sense want to celebrate, even if it's mostly about kind of getting chocolate Easter eggs. I wrote a really small, skinny little book. I'll show you quite how skinny, called Is Easter Unbelievable?, which is designed to be given to neighbors, family members, colleagues, friends, whoever, to just give people a very accessible, easy to read sort of introduction to Christianity. One more hopeful note is that on the back cover, one of the people who endorsed the book is a history professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He became a Christian just last year, when she was already a professor. So God is absolutely in the business of saving people even today. The other guy in the back became a Christian when he was an undergrad at Cambridge University, and he's now a professor at MIT. So again, God is in the business of saving people who seem kind of unlikely. I don't know, Brian, did you manage to find copies in our basement? Okay. I was going to bring you tons of copies because I have tons of copies, but we can't find them in the house right now. So if you would like a copy or several copies, if there are people in your life who it could just be an easy kind of, hey, happy Easter, here's a little book, you can read it over coffee. If there's anybody in your life who you think that could be helpful for, I would love to just give you a copy for free to do that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's so helpful, and I think it's just wise advice as Easter is coming to use the opportunities before us. And I think the temptation that I feel, and I think we often feel, is almost to make a decision for someone. We're thinking, I might want to invite this person to join us on Easter Sunday. But then I begin to think, well, I think they'd probably say no. So I'm just not going to ask them because I think they would already say no. So I've already just made up my mind for them. So the worst that could happen is they would tell us no to an invitation like that. But I don't think they're probably offended because it matters to you and you're inviting them to that. So we'll figure out a way to make those books available. And thanks, Rebecca, for sharing those and making those available to us. So now we spend a little bit of time praying tonight. And so there may be something in your life that we could pray with you for. And so in a moment, you can just raise your hand and we're going to have you just nice and loud. Stand up, tell us your name, tell us what we could pray for. It might be something we could give thanks to you with, something that we've prayed for in the past or you've prayed for in the past and God has provided or God has answered a prayer. You can share that. There might be someone you're trying to share the gospel with, or maybe even just tonight, someone has come to mind. You haven't actually talked to them yet, but thinking towards Easter, you say, this is a person that I want to try to invite and share with. We'd love to pray for you in that as well. We have a few other requests of things that are coming on in the life of the church that we'll have you pray for also. So I'll share a few, we'll pray, and then we'd love for you to share if there's some things that we could pray for as well. So first, we'd love to pray for a church planter that we support who lives in Quebec and who was just here this